Well, I agree with a lot of the vernacular that we heard from Chris, but I recognize that we share some same vocabulary, but a little bit a different dictionary, if you will. And having had a lot of discussions with Chris and reading his book, he is obviously advocating for theistic determinism as the explanation as to how God pulls off this narrative, which means that he's concluded that in order for God to pull off this situation with Rebekah, that God has to predetermine everything that takes place in time. He has to play both sides of the chessboard to make sure it happens exactly, meticulously, the way he wants it to.
So if the objection is that there could be other ways of doing it, then suggest how it works. Molinism isn't going to do it. Simple foreknowledge isn't going to do it. How does this work? Because I was asking somebody in Twitter this morning. So Paul could have said no. Paul could have said, no, I'm not going to, whoever you are in the bright light, I'm not going to submit to you. And so now God has to go strike somebody else off their donkey. And now his timing's also, now it's plan B, et cetera, et cetera. Is that what you are saying? And the guy said, yeah. So this specific timing, the servant says, I'm going at this place at this time. There is no plan B. There is no plan B. You have to have an understanding that can allow for all these choices of human beings to be responsible choices that they can be judged by, and yet God can accomplish his purpose, not only in this instance, but this is the whole foundation of prophecy, folks. You know, the prophecies that demonstrate that Jesus was the Messiah, you know, that stuff? Millions of creaturely choices involved in every one of those prophecies. You telling me that God was just doing the best he could to try to cobble something back together again after man messes it up over and over and over and over again by his free choices? See, that's why Flowers won't give us a specific. He gives us as well, Molinism, and then you got this one over here. That's a target you can't shoot at. It doesn't mean anything. It's empty.
And I think that's a lower view of sovereignty. And with all due respect to Chris, I think what he advocates for in this narrative seems to be more of a philosophical assumption being read into the text rather than a biblical conclusion drawn from the text itself.
Which, of course, is what we say is everything that Leighton Flowers does. That's exactly what he does all the time. So both sides are making the same accusation. Which side can prove it is the question. But this idea of that's a low view of sovereignty. Let's catch how this is going to work. What you do is you tell an audience that maybe hasn't thought these things through, doesn't realize that what God is really doing is in his decree. He is creating the conditions of his own self-glorification. And that he's doing so in such a way that he can demonstrate his justice in the just judgment of those who rebel against him and his great grace in the salvation of those who are not deserving of his grace. He's doing all of that in this world so that there is no purposeless evil. He's actually accomplishing his purpose in everything that's taking place. And the higher view, which Leighton thinks he has, is this idea that God basically makes good stuff come out of bad stuff that man creates. Now, there's all sorts of stuff that he doesn't make good come out of, I guess. So there's all sorts of purposeless evil. But then in these specific things that allows him to accomplish salvation in some fashion, or at least make salvation available, that's the big thing that, I mean, Leighton's new book is all about the possibility, the provision of salvation, not the actual accomplishment of salvation. I mean, it's good that it's out there to say, these are two different sides. One side says God saves, one side says God makes salvation possible. That's always been the divide between the Reformation and Rome. And Leighton has demonstrated he is thoroughly on this subject, on the subject of of provision, possibility, accomplishment, will. He is absolutely with Erasmus against Luther. He is against the Reformation, which he's against Reformed theology. So he is a popeless Catholic when it comes to this issue. And any See, the more he keeps getting pushed into deeper and deeper synergism, there's no way to avoid that. There's no way to avoid that. That's how it works.
It's the difference between eisegesis and exegesis. And so exegesis teaches us what is the
Given our debate, I just, whenever he starts talking about the difference between eisegesis and exegesis, I just want to go, glad you've learned that since then.
Intention of the author. And I don't think the person giving this narrative, it's not a didactic text, by the way, it's a narrative. I don't think the person telling us this story is trying to teach us God meticulously, deterministically causes everybody's sinful actions and choices for all time. I just don't believe that's the intention of the author.
No, the author was not attempting to discuss that subject at this point. No. The whole point of the presentation, however, was that you cannot understand this type of incident, and there are many other incidents like this in the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament, because it's much more narrative material in the Old Testament. You can't understand any of these texts without the overarching understanding of the meticulous providence of God, that this was the worldview and theology that united all the writers of Scripture, the prophets, et cetera, et cetera.
And so I think that's just a philosophical assumption. And I think there are a lot better answers to the way in which this could be brought to pass.
Now, so far, have we heard anything biblical? Have we heard him go into the text? Because he knew what the texts were going to be beforehand. I think that was pretty obvious. I think they exchanged these texts. Because I could tell later, when Leighton gets to present his, that Chris Date had already knew what they were. So he had, he was reading from a response. So I think he would have known. So if there was something in the text that he could use to overthrow this, this would be where you'd be hearing it, but we're not hearing anything at all.
If, for example, Justin, I were to tell you that I'm a computer programmer and I created a virtual world online.
See, here we go. Instead of exegesis, what do you get? I'm now going to be God. I'm going to be a computer programmer. And so I'm going to start with the allegories. I'm going to start with the stories. Rather than going into the text itself.
With all kinds of avatars that look exactly like Abraham's servant and Rebecca, and the whole scenario plays out exactly as was just portrayed there in Genesis 24 on my virtual world. Would you be very impressed in how I brought about the answer to Abraham's servant's prayer? Well, of course you wouldn't. You would just say, well, that's a script being coded, and they did exactly as they were coded to do in that deterministic type of world. And that takes the supernatural out of it. And
now you see where the reality is. And again, I despair of Leighton ever accurately representing us here, because he is absolutely committed to the flattening out of what we're saying into a two-dimensional area. There is no room for the reality of, and how many times have I said this now? The incarnation demonstrates the importance and reality of time and events in space. The Son of God was not a robot. The Son of God was not a puppet. He did not enter into a CGI simulation, a chess game, or anything else. He entered into true human existence. It does not change the fact that the exact second of his self-sacrificial death was determined in the divine decree of God before eternity began. It doesn't change any of that. You have to believe both. He refuses to believe both, and so he flattens it all out, and in the process, you have to twist Scripture. That's just all there is to it. He has to flatten it out. He can't deal with what we actually believe. And here you hear it once again.
I just really believe that God's bringing about his purposes despite and sometimes through the libertarianly free choices of creatures. I don't think he has to determine people's evil desires, thoughts, and actions in a meticulous way in order to bring something like this to pass.
So Chris, Leighton's view...
Okay, now, Justin jumps in here to go back to Chris, but I was like, that's all you're going to say? He does not mind at all if someone listens to something like this and goes, all right, this guy gave Bible and that guy gave story. Because evidently he's got enough supporters that would go, and I like story better than Bible. Because I saw people A discussion started on Twitter, and I saw people go, "Oh, that was great," and yeah, Calvinists just can't answer anything. And I was trying to talk with the guy last night or this morning, where it was like, "Hey, as soon as you say that God has a secret will other than his prescriptive will, that's irrational. It just, and I pushed on it, and immediately, it just explodes into various forms of heresy. But those folks are going to be more impressed by story time with Uncle Leighton than they are anything else. So, wow, we've already gone over jumbo time, but I'll try to finish this up. Aren't you getting arthritis in that shoulder by now? Okay. Anyway, he's good. Never mind. All right, so we just got one other to look at here. So then the subject turned to Genesis chapter 50, and there you had, I get the feeling that no, I guess it didn't. Must be getting warm outside or something, because it's certainly, I'm going to crank it down a little bit there. Genesis chapter 50, obviously this is one of the key texts. Mr. Date went through it rather thoroughly. You cannot escape the reality that on the grammatical level, on the lexicographical level, there is a direct parallel taught by the text that God intended one thing, the brothers intended one thing, and the one thing's the same thing. The intention of the brothers was evil, the intention of God was good. And this didn't come up, or at least I didn't hear it come up. Maybe I missed it. But one of the aspects of Genesis 50 is that to save many people alive to this day. I don't know how a Leighton Flowers deals with Psalm 139. He's written my days in his book. My days are determined by hundreds of thousands, millions of personal decisions, not only my own, but of many others. As I'm riding my bike down the road, the personal decision of a person to be on Twitter while driving will determine the length of my days. The personal decision of a person who messes up in the cooking of my food in a restaurant can end my days. I mean, there's so many things. The idea that God's just doing his best to put stuff back together again after all these libertarianly free things demonstrates a really naive and simplistic view of the complexity of events in time. And you have no way. The open theists, again, are at least consistent. They're at least consistent. God didn't know you were going to exist. God doesn't know how long you're going to live. Has no idea. So he has no overarching plans like that. He's got the big framework type thing. He can do monsoons and earthquakes, stuff like that. But individual, got to be totally free. At least they're consistent. Molinism isn't. Simple foreknowledge isn't. And who knows what Flowers' actual position is on this. But anyway, so Genesis 50 has been presented. It has been demonstrated beyond all shadow of a doubt that there is direct parallel. God intended this. Man intended this. They have different purposes in intending. But God's purpose is to save many people alive to this day. So there it is. It's out on the table. Let's hear the response from Leighton Flowers. Last thing we do on the program today.
Well, sure. I'd back up a little bit and look at the context of the text, because the original intent of the brothers was not to sell the brother into slavery. If you look through the narrative, their original intent was murderous. They wanted to kill him because of pride. They were jealous.
So evidently, God can actually keep people from committing sin. He restrains evil. Yes. So how are they autonomous? I don't know.
Well, where does pride originate? Where does that come from? 1 John 2:16 says, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. So whatever we conclude here, we cannot go against what Scripture teaches us and conclude that some eternal divine decree is the cause or the origin of these brothers' pride.
Now, there's some scripture twisting for you. That's not what John was talking about. I just happened to have preached on this text on Sunday, actually. And what John is talking about is he's saying to Christians, do not love the world nor the things of the world, for the world's passing away. And all these things that come from the world, the foolish pride of life, all this type of stuff, does not come from God. It does not come from the Father. It's come from the world. The world is passing away, but he who abides doing the will of God, he will abide forever. That's the text in 1 John chapter 2. So what does that have to do with what we're dealing with here? The argument is actually saying, well, since that comes from the world, then it's not a part of God's sovereign decree. Now, again, this is no knowledgeable former Calvinist with an honest bone in his body would ever make that argument because he knows it's irrelevant to what we believe. I mean, the very fact that Leighton thinks that's an argument again proves the man was clueless when he thought he was a Calvinist. He had no idea what he was talking about. He was not Reformed. Whatever he was, self-deceived, maybe he read a Banner of Truth article and went, I like that, and never thought about it again. I don't know. But he clearly doesn't understand that John's talking about the fact that those earthly lusts don't come from God. Doesn't mean that God has not determined everything that takes place in time. John is writing to Christians and saying, look, do the will of God. Love the Father, because there's nothing to be found in the world. And all the foolish pride of life and everything else, that's not part of the love of the Father. That's something that comes out of your attachment to the world, to which we have died. He's not talking about the reality that God is accomplishing his purposes. And by the way, Flowers, again, I'm sorry to have to repeat this, over and over again, functions upon the idea that we as Christians can somehow know the content of God's decree. We don't know the content of God's decree until we look backwards. We can't see it as we look forward. All we have is the prescriptive will of God, where he says, don't love the world's passing away, the love of the Father is different than this. That's what we live on. We don't live on the basis of some divine decree, and we will not be judged on the basis of the divine decree. We are judged on the basis of what God has revealed. So they basically just simply cannot allow for it. And this is why I find it, this will result in a 4-hour edition of his podcast, cowardly. I find it cowardly that you will continuously mock, well, yeah, I must have been sovereignly decreed to do that, when you do not provide anything even close to a meaningful theodicy or doctrine of God's knowledge and relationship to time. If you can sit there and throw out Molinism or this, that's cowardice. That's cowardice. That's all it is. There you go. So that, are we up to 6 hours now? At least, minimally. I don't think he'll sleep tonight. I don't think so.
We have to come to a better conclusion than to impugn, I think, again, unintentionally, I think Chris's view impugns the character of God in that way. And so what we would say...
Now remember, the other side has laid out an exegetical argument. He's gone into the Hebrew. He's talked about verb forms and terminations, suffixes as direct objects, the whole 9 yards. What are we hearing so far? Are we going to get anything like that?
Yeah, I'll give an analogy. For example, police officers create a sting operation where they know of notorious drug dealers in the area. They know their intention. They know that they're evil. And they don't cause, but they use the evil intention of criminals in order to bring about...
Now remember, the text says God intended. The brothers intended. He cannot allow God to intend the same way that man intends. He has to come up with a different way. Now, again, how many times are stings set up that don't work? How many times did God try this before he got it right? Yeah.
The selling of drugs at a particular time on Thursday at 2:00 in the warehouse so as to catch all the drug dealers in one place in the sting operation. So the police officers meant that selling of drugs an evil crime for a good reason. while the criminals meant it for a bad reason. So the same crime, the same act is being meant by both the police officers and the criminals. One is being meant for an evil purpose, for selfish gain. The other is being meant for a good purpose. And in the same way, in this scenario, obviously God meant what the brothers did for a good purpose, for redemption.
God meant it. He meant it, not set up the situation where they might be able to do it. He intended it to save people alive. And on Leighton's position, they might not have acted that way. They were free not to act that way. Libertarianly free, which means if they hadn't, then God would not have been able to save people alive, right? See, this is the cowardice in not taking a stand and saying, okay, this is how it works. It's like, well, I don't know. All I know is yours isn't right.
So God's not redeeming his own determinations here. He's redeeming the brothers' bad determinations. He's bringing a good from the bad. He's not causing the bad so as to just redeem his own determination.
Chris.
So notice there, this is another one of his new, not new things, the things he's been doing for a while now. If there is a sovereign decree, then everything is God's determination. Therefore, he's just redeeming his own determinations. Again, flatten it out. Get rid of man's role in it. Just as Acts chapter 4, you've got Pilate and Herod and the Romans and the Jews, and they're all acting for different reasons. No. Flatten it all out, and God's just redeeming his own determinations. See, that's how he has to do it. He can't deal with Reformed theology as it is, so he flatten it out, and then hope that the people he's talking to, if they're quote-unquote Reformed, are malformed in their Reformed theology, have never done any reading past basic level stuff, or if they're not Reformed, are not going to go and actually read someone and go, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't quite represent where we're coming from. But exegetically, nada. All you get's the cop story. And again, I just don't think Leighton cares. I just think he thinks, hey, as long as it works, fine and dandy.